So I'll just make a few brief comments. One, to thank a couple of people, specifically Professor Bennett, Dr. Bennett, who has been a absolute, integral participant in developing these, extended events and other activities, and has been a major contributor to developing the archives and supporting the Wilhelm Reich Trust and Museum up in Organon. And I strongly urge everybody, just let me make a little appeal, the museum is, as always, on hard times and looking to raise money, so if you can contribute to the museum, go on their site and make a contribution. It's, well worth it. And right now, they've been attempting to preserve and maintain Reich's original library, and monies are needed for that, and a number of other projects. And people interested in that can talk to, particularly to Dr. Bennett, who's very aware, can give you information, or me, and the other person I'd like to thank, who has been one of my stalwart companions through developing this whole program and all of our seminars. There's some other literature here for people who are interested. David Silver, who is on headphones and camera, who has documented almost all of this work going back to the beginning. It's well over 25 years now. And on our website that he maintains, you can also access a list of all of the videos and audio tapes that we have, including tapes of actually Dr. Sobey and Dr. Rothenberg and a number of other people who are no longer with us or aren't here today. Anyways, promised they would be here, but Dr. Nelson and a number of other people. So there is an active community. I guess I want to start, before I make my initial remarks, introduction. I have the first part of this lecture for me is something I'm very comfortable with, which is its history and dynamic background. The second part, and I have been a little bit more reticent in coming to this particular day in terms of doing a thing on therapy or dealing with the open discussion of therapy and how it works, mainly because I have some sense that it really doesn't address what therapy is. It never really manages to get at what therapy, especially orgone therapy, really is. And I guess I'm old school when it comes to that. But that said, I've agreed to participate, therefore I will be a good and willing participant. My background is, as I said, I came to orgonomy through a general interest going back for many, many years as a kid, but actively started working with Dr. Sobey in 1976. Just anecdotally, in those days, you got the name of the one or two orgonomists who were around, who were really trained, and you got yourself on a waiting list. There was actually such a thing as a waiting list. And when Dr. Sobey called, or Dr. Handelman, or a few others that were really orgonomists, and said, I have an opening, waited 3 or 4 weeks, and I got a call saying, I have an opening this afternoon at 3 o'clock. No matter what you were doing, you just took it. That was the only way, or it moved on. So that was also, I think, an important distinction. There were, and as often comes up in these discussions, and I think Dr. Schiff already alluded to this, there is a long and active tradition of what is called Reichian therapy. Reich hated that term, hated that idea, and he, as others, as Freud said too, as Freud said about Freudian therapies, that he was the only Freudian. The others were, So it's, just as one is, a psychoanalyst, one can talk about one's orientation or one's particular, relationship to various aspects of Freud's work. In the same thing, if one does this work, and you're trained in this work or actively involved in this work, it's orgonomy. Okay, and if you do treatment, it's orgone treatment, and if you're trained, you should be trained formally as an orgonomist. Reichian therapy is fine. There are all sorts of Reichian offshoots and things that were picked up, whether it was Gestalt or primal or core energetics or any number of things that are related to and use insights and aspects of Reich's work, but the actual clinical practice is orgonomy. So what I will talk about really is the development of orgonomy as a practice, and that is there's a specific arc of development, okay, and that places it into an historical moment. If anything comes up or people have pressing comments as I move through the historical presentation and critical presentation, feel free to interrupt, since I have a reputation for doing so when I'm sitting on your side. I'm known to not be able to contain my impulse to talk, but for now I have the permission to indulge that, so I will. Anyway, and some of these dates will be less exact, and I'm sure Dr. Bennett and some of you as participants who have been very involved in the history could dispute or argue about whether a date is exactly right. One of the things that Dr. Bennett is doing is really a very careful archival research as to actually when and exactly things actually happened. And Jim Strict, who's a historian of science who's working on orgonomy, is really setting some dates. Some of these dates are inexact, mainly because that's what they were, inexact. I mean, Reich was not one who specifically said on such and such day or such and such time I'm going to start such and such project or I became officially. So in one sense, Reich's interest in orgonomy, if we think of it in terms of his last remarks about his work, which were that he was always consistently pursuing the issue of energy and the nature and function of energy. In one sense, his interest in this really goes back to his earliest, if you read in his memoirs going back to, his earliest life, his passion for youth, which is part of the series of memoirs that have been released. The final volume is in preparation now. He talks about basically by around 1919, 1920, as a medical student and as someone who was beginning to enter the psychoanalytic community, beginning to be interested in the nature and function of energy, in the origins of illness and pathology, and begins to talk about it, but certainly doesn't talk about it in anything that would approach his final formulation. But he himself says in Reich Speaks on Freud, which are these wonderful interviews in which he talks about his and reminisces about his involvement with psychoanalysis and with Freud particularly, that he could see a direct red thread throughout his entire career through his work, which was essentially the attempt to understand the nature and function of energy in the living, or in nature. Right? And in one sense, I think that distinguishes Reich in many ways from almost any other therapist, including Freud. I would say, I mean, Dr. Weitzman might argue with that, I'm not sure, but Reich's interest in energetic function from a very, very early stage of his investigations and studies, I think distinguishes him as a very different kind of presence in that world, both for better and worse. I mean, there are times that it leads to conflicts and issues that are not resolvable within the community that he's operated in, and certainly led in some ways, I think, eventually to his moving away from and breaking with the psychoanalytic community. But it remains central to everything I have to say and everything I think that we're going to look at in terms of how orgone therapy works, or what orgone therapy is, or what orgonomy is. I think there'll be distinctions over the day between orgone therapy, which is a very specific clinical application of Reich's fundamental and primary discoveries and technical developments, and orgonomy, which is a much broader range of scientific and potential practical applications, and then the yet broader issues of Reichian influence in the general therapeutic community and in the general population. Just this week, in a meeting with Kevin Hinchy from the Reich Museum, the Trust, and a documentarist who I'm collaborating with, we're beginning to develop a possible, full-length documentary, which has been in the works for a while. We were talking about really just one of the things I think that will hopefully emerge here, and is often lost, is just how pervasive Reich's influence has been. Not only, in one sense, what really gets clear is, even though he's marginalized now and very, very obscure in some ways, the 20th century, and certainly much of the 21st century, almost is not conceivable without Reich as a catalyst. Not necessarily, he didn't create it. I'm not being that out of touch with reality. But certainly the questions that he asked and the issues that he investigated and the areas in which he moved into investigation and active engagement with were all the central issues that we're still struggling with today. As I listened this morning to people noshing and talking about medications and vaccinations and child rearing and this and that, and my wife is a midwife, and the birth and et cetera, et cetera. All of these things, and politics, fascism, fundamentalism, are all the things that essentially Reich really put into, he wasn't alone, there were many around him, but he was the central catalytic and charismatic figure that really introduced this into the language, and in many ways established much of the vocabulary that, while often is not vocabulary like holistic or bioenergetic or alternate approaches, these are terms that essentially Reich really put into play. Interpersonal therapy, the idea of training people in a very organized and careful and responsible way. These were all things that Reich, and then the responsibility of the therapist, whatever their practice, to being socially engaged and involved in social activism, was also something that Reich was instrumental in putting into play. So with that preamble, let me just start that it's really pretty much between 1929 and 1936 that Reich begins to break with the psychoanalytic movement. Historically, in the years between 1918 and 1930, Reich comes after the First World War. Reich arrives in Vienna, prepared to study law. Someone is eventually going to address why almost every one of the key figures in modern psychodynamic psychology often start out with the idea that they're going to become lawyers. Freud himself was originally going to be on the law faculty, and then Reich is an example, and then numerous others. I think I saw someplace that Jung at one point was considering law.
Given later events, it's kind of unthinkable to imagine him being a lawyer.
Right. Well. Obviously, he found it unthinkable himself too. Within about, I think, by all accounts, within a few months or so, he decided that the law faculty at the University of Vienna was not where he wanted to be, and he himself says that the really exciting thing was the exciting game in town, where things were really happening were the lectures and the seminars around the new psychoanalytic community. And he attended that pretty much as a student and moved into the faculty of medicine, which was essentially, most people should understand, was essentially within the School of Philosophy. One got your medical degree in the School of Philosophy. He quickly, at a very young age, got the attention of the inner circle, meaning the older guys who were in and around Freud. Freud was seldom present, but he got regular reports from his close associates. And Reich was tagged as someone who should be drawn in and encouraged. And I like to tell people, which is always fascinating, the way you got trained when Reich started his training, not just Reich, all training was quite simply that one of the older, more established therapists, sometimes Freud himself, if he had contact with you, would say, "You're a bright young man or a bright young woman." Women were encouraged to. "Here's my card, and be at such and such place, or your apartment tomorrow between 12 and 1, and someone will arrive and present my card also to you, and that will be your first patient. Start doing therapy, start doing treatment." And you would, and Reich himself describes it. He would look and say, "Well, what do I do?" And the older analyst would say, "Listen, and when you run into a problem, come to me and talk about it." And that was training. Well, some years later, by the mid-1920s, Reich, along with others, were articulating. Reich took that very seriously, but he also took it as very, very clear mandate to read everything. Reich was, massively, it's a polymath. I mean, he basically just consumed knowledge. So when he decided that he was going to be a psychoanalyst, he just consumed all of the material that he possibly could about this, and took this quite seriously and asked a lot of questions. But it became very obvious to him that there was no consistent way of learning how to be a psychoanalyst, and what was needed, quite clearly, and Reich always was very clear-sighted in this and practical, is my sense, the way I get it from reading the journals and letters and interviews with him, and interviews with people who knew him. He came up with the obvious solution, which is that there should be some seminar, some way of training individuals that is consistent, in terms of basic presentation of what one needs to know to be a psychoanalyst. That became, with the permission of Freud, the Viennese polyclinic or training seminar. Reich was disappointed initially, since he was the younger. He was not initially appointed as the director, but he was the associate director. But eventually became the director of the seminar. It was out of that program that what we know today as Reich's really premier work, which is character analysis, emerged. Okay. The other thing you can keep in mind as we go through the discussions today is that for those of us who are scholars of this, Reich tended to write books based on where he was at the moment. So the initial presentation of character analysis looks very, very little like the final edition, although it has obviously clear parallels, and some of the material actually remains from the original edition as it's incorporated into the final edition. What you read, what most of us read or use as character analysis is really it's debatable. It's the third. We call it the third edition. It might well be the fourth edition, depending on some transitory moments between editions. But basically, it's the first development of character analysis emerged out of that seminar. One thing to keep in mind, again, in terms of Reich's interest here, was in locating the nature of the problems and how therapy doesn't work. Right? What's wrong? What goes wrong in doing therapy? Reich had a strict rule, which is seldom applied, except in my seminars when I do training. Dr. Sobey kept with that, as Dr. Whiteson would, I think, agree. And certainly in the few seminar-like interactions I had, or training interactions I had with Dr. Rothenberg out in Seattle, the premise that Reich introduced was that one does not talk about successes or the positive outcomes of therapy. You bring in problems. So actually, I teased Bob Teeger about being a problem case. You brought your patients to Dr. Reich if you were doing consultations only because you were having a problem. And Dr. Sobey would often anecdotally account, you would bring your patient who you were having a problem with to Dr. Reich, of course, and he would spend 5-10 minutes and say, well, here's the problem. And he would do, and he would say, why didn't I see that? And Dr. Reich, in great generosity, would say, you didn't see that because you're not as trained or as capable as I am, and I've been doing it longer, and I'm more qualified. But you'll get there. You just, you come to me because you have a problem, and you learn. And so what emerged was initially the work known as character analysis. And this is, I'm recently with one of my students, we're about 3/4 of the way through character analysis, and if you've never read it page by page, it's a wonderful thing to do if you have people who you can do it with, to read it page by page out loud with each other and talk about it as you go along. It's take a couple of years, but it's okay. So what emerges there is character analysis, even in its final editions, is very, very strongly rooted in psychoanalysis and in traditional psychoanalysis. But he's already beginning to push the boundaries of psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic practice and psychoanalytic theory. Much, in some ways, less theory than practice. What it gets clear as you read even the last edition of character analysis, which is clearly already moved into and been influenced by 1944 by the developments of Reich's work that have pulled him away from mainstream psychoanalysis, is character analysis, at least until the last part of character analysis, the infamous third part, which we'll get to in a minute. It is how strongly rooted his discussions and his examples and his case studies are in psychoanalytic practice, and how much psychoanalysis or the constrictions of or the parameters of psychoanalysis form how and what treatment should be, right? What is also fascinating, it seems to me, as you read this, is you begin to see clearly, even before he introduces the concept of energy, and particularly of orgone energy, that in the earliest formulations, Reich is uncomfortable with just verbal, intellectual examination of the underlying problems of psychodynamic problems of a patient's pathology, and that often in discussion he gets to a point where he feels limited, or the discussion is limited because it can't go far enough or deep enough into what is really preventing the patient from breaking through or coming through or resolving. Don't forget, traditionally, certainly in the 1930s and into the 40s, Dr. Whiteson will address this today, but in Freud's terms, intellectual insight and understanding was the key process for working through or resolving the neurosis. Reich increasingly came up with that not only in the seminars but in his examination of patients, his work with patients, that this just simply wasn't the case, and that he gives often examples of patients who start out with phenomenal insight into exactly why historically and intellectually they're in the position they're in, and you don't get any place. So already with character analysis, he begins to realize that there are these incredible things that go on in the room, in the one-to-one relationship, in the interpersonal relationship with the patient, And that in itself is a unique, a beginning of a unique quality of Reich's work, which is he becomes increasingly interested, more than Freud or almost any of the others, in the idea of the interpersonal relationship between the patient and the therapist. And by interpersonal, we don't mean just countertransferential. There's a very strong sense when you read Reich at this early stage that he's getting increasingly interested in what happens between the physical presence of the therapist and the physical presence of the patient in the activity of therapy. And what this does is it brings him literally around the couch. So he makes a major deviation, which is he moves from behind the patient in a more passive position, which had become traditional with Freud. You also, many of you have heard this many times, some of you might for the first time. You have to understand that the traditional psychoanalytic position behind the couch, right, behind the patient, was an innovation of Freud's, mainly an adjustment for the fact that Freud could not stand facing his patients. We have this in writing, in Freud's journals and letters. He talks about how he couldn't stand looking at his patients when he talked to them. Plus, he would get
to see when he fell asleep.
Right. Well, no, that was the next thing, and that he would often get bored or distracted and didn't want that to interfere with the patient's ongoing flow.
He didn't want him to see his reaction.
Right, or his reactions, but often his reactions were, and along with that, there was the again official orthodox view that a session was 50 minutes, the so-called notorious 50-minute hour, which I think was one of the first books I read on on psychoanalysis, a famous book called The 50-Minute Hour. That was also developed because Freud simply found that he could not go past 50 minutes. That was the limit of what he could tolerate being in,
He did it 7 days a week.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's true. In fairness.
And then 6.
Yeah. But these kinds of stylistic innovations became critical. Reich, on the other hand, began to feel that these were, and had the courage, in a sense, to say, why do we have to do it that way? Or I can't do it that way. And he began to make alterations. The key alteration was moving from behind the patient to basically on the side of the patient. And in doing so, what he discovered, I think, very, very critically, was that by doing that, interesting, changed your perspective, and you saw things about the patient that you couldn't see from when you were sitting behind them. And one of the things that you began to see was their physical, presentation on the couch, and their physical activity and their characteristic ways of behaving as they interacted and did their free association in the more traditional sense. Gradually during this period of time, he also begins to become aware of the fact that every patient presents a characteristic way of behaving, and that if you keep banging, he literally uses the word banging away, hitting away at that characteristic way of behaving, eventually patients will break down or break through, or some combination of both, if you're successful, and they will begin to reveal more and more about what is deeply hidden and deeply repressed and inaccessible. And that more significantly, and this is what began to get him in trouble even then, it happened faster. It happened faster than the more traditional psychoanalytic practice of the time in terms of strict free association. But this was a violation of some of the primary rules. This meant greater presence, greater interference. But even so, at this time, Reich was not yet willing to cross that boundary in which he actively went after the patient where they were, right? So he was getting closer to that. And so in character analysis, you begin to get the articulation of the fact that what you need to do is interpret what is to stay focused on behavior, to stay focused on the details of the way the individual behaves and presents themselves, and then to stay focused specifically on the defenses and resistances that the patient constantly presents, and following the intricate ways that they will elaborate and maintain those defenses. And his view becomes increasingly articulated that if you keep doing that, eventually the patient, in a sense, will become trapped in their own behaviors and will have to come at you. It can, if not handled properly, it can produce high levels of anxiety and disaster. And often in character analysis, he's very anxious to present. In most of the cases he presents as cases who then became so disturbed, so upset, so agitated that they either broke off or couldn't sustain, the process. But nonetheless, what he was able to distill from that is that something happened that was quite explosive, quite, distinctively different than the traditional analytic, process. It was active. And he begins already in the early presentations of character analysis to see this as some sort of energetic process. There's something that's going on energetically. He then, at this point, is already in his journals and his letters thinking about this in relationship to Freud's ideas about libido, and we remember that while Freud presents the idea of psychosexual energy and libido as something that's genuine, he tends to avoid any real discussion of it, and he assumes that it will eventually be studied and discovered and probably some sort of biochemical, substance. But he is not particularly concerned about the actual literal presentation of that energy. He's certainly not going into the lab to investigate it. Reich, on the other hand, whether out of naivety or enthusiasm, decides that, well, I'm seeing something going on here in treatment. I got to know what that energy is, and he begins to, as early as the late 20s and 30s, before the 30s, he begins to investigate what that energy might be. And while he doesn't set up an active laboratory yet, he begins to look at and begins to explore, both anecdotally and to some degree clinically, the nature of what this energy might be. And he begins to become clear that the key move now would be to demonstrate the existence of a literal, of what this libidinal energy might literally be. And in doing so, by the early 1930s, he begins to be increasingly marginalized in the mainstream of psychoanalysis at that time. And I think historically a number of things were going on. Reich thought he had a mandate, and by all accounts, autobiographically and biographically, Freud indicated to him that he did have a mandate to proceed and to study, although it turns out that there were some mixed signals. I mean, he was told things and encouraged to do things while there were behind-the-scenes negotiations to marginalize him and to basically sidetrack him. But he begins to actively, along with a number of other younger, what were known as a kindergarten group, they begin to investigate the nature of this energy and its implications in terms of treatment. At a time when psychoanalysis with Freud and the inner circle is beginning to try to normalize and become a much more respectable, much more mainstream practice, Reich winds up presenting more increasingly radical concepts, radical ideas, radical proposals. The single most radical proposal, and we're not even addressing now what was also going on in terms of his political activism, which was also introducing significant tension between himself and the mainstream of the analytic movement. But in keeping with orgone therapy and the history of orgone therapy, Reich begins to postulate and demonstrate the existence of what he considers a basic natural energy, or what he assumes is the libido, or libidinal energy operating in the organism, and begins to propose, as early as probably 1934, if not before, the idea that if one were to liberate or to allow this energy to flow freely in the organism and metabolize freely in the organism, you would see breakthrough or breakdown, depending on who the patient was. And if handled and managed properly, you could really accomplish major therapeutic success. And in process of doing this, really establish what he then proposes is the ultimate and natural function of this energy. And it's at this point that he introduces what will lead to his next major period and step. He begins to write on the function of the orgasm. Now, it's very important historically to understand that Reich's ideas on the function of the orgasm are not unique in and of themselves. In that Freud himself talked about the nature and function of excitation in the pleasure principle. I mean, we can argue about whether he was... certainly Freud was not at the point of talking about the function of the orgasm. But he certainly, in the pleasure principle, introduces the idea of excitation and discharge and the experience of pleasure. Reich takes this further and really, in his explorations and in his studies, begins to articulate the actual nature and function of this energy that he's talking about. He begins to describe this energy and what he both suspects this energy is and what he's able to actually demonstrate this energy to literally be. Again, he's seeing this and he's assuming at this point that it is a bioelectrical energy of some sort, and begins to do his investigations that will lead to his final breakthrough in this area, called the bioelectrical investigations of sexuality and anxiety. But his preliminary research leads him to the decision that the key to maintaining stability in the organism is to maintaining the effective pulsation and regulation of the organism. Okay, I got to rush along then. Okay, okay, sorry, I'll speed it up. And as such, he articulates in the function of the orgasm, at least the initial rendering of that book, which is actually now available in a book called Genitality, the idea that health in the organism is the maintenance of the ability of the organism to charge and discharge efficiently and effectively through the orgasm, the function of the orgasm. Charge, tension, discharge, and relaxation. And if that can be established, and if we can develop techniques to establish that, we can produce increasingly healthy organisms. And if we can develop techniques for maintaining that kind of healthy functioning, self-regulatory functioning in the individual, you're moving towards a treatment model that produces specific, concrete, verifiable conditions for health. This period between 1934 and 1938, just quickly, is known as the period of the vegetotherapy, development of vegetotherapy, which is what Reich now began to call his new treatment. This pretty much ends his association. It also coincides with ending his association with the psychoanalytic movement. There are also things can come up in discussion or in questioning. This is also the period where he breaks with the psychoanalytic movement. The official psychoanalytic position is that they broke with him. I think the evidence is very clear that Reich, it's mutual, but Reich clearly decides to go his own way. He might not have had any choice, but he clearly decides to go his own way.
What year did they expel him from?
1933.
33.
The conference in 34.
Well, 30.
That's what he finds out.
That's what he finds out. But in 33, it was pretty much
They
decided.
refused to Freud didn't want to publish
In
a
33.
paper on masochism
Right,
because it was political.
Right.
And then they kicked him out a year later.
Right. He was officially dismissed. It was at the second internet. Was the third international at 34. Yeah, I think you're right. But it was already decided in 33 that Reich was an embarrassment, according to Freud. He was too extreme. And it's in the development of the vegetotherapy modality that Reich begins to really define what we classically know as the functional identity of body, mind, and behavior. Okay, and the centrality and places the function of the orgasm as the central goal of all treatment and clinical engagement in doing this treatment. This completely diverges from psychoanalytic practice, certainly in terms of where it was at that time, and probably, although there might be, Dr. Weitzner can address it, there might be some coming together, some of this, but probably not from what I hear in terms of discussions of what goes on at the New York Psychoanalytic Institute these days. But Reich really has now begun a new movement with new goals, and it's that goal of establishing genital primacy and genital and the goal of natural and healthy genital function that becomes the central defining aspect of orgone therapy, or vegetotherapy as it was initially defined. And in simplest terms, the movement from vegetotherapy, which largely begins to phase out as an active name that they use for therapy, at least in those around Reich, by 1937 or so, 38, depends. When he comes to the United States in 1939, Dr. Bennett could probably address it. I think they begin to stop using the term vegetotherapy here. In Norway and other, it's still used. The distinction here is that vegetotherapy simply describes the techniques which most of us as actively practicing orgone therapists would still use today. There's nothing very radically different. The distinction is that at the time when vegetotherapy was being articulated, Reich was still working with the idea that you were dealing with essentially a bioelectrical, biochemical organization within the energetic function. By the time between 1937 and 1939, Reich's laboratory work and scientific investigations lead him to the final conclusion and feeling that he's made the final demonstration that this energy is not in fact, and I'm not going to elaborate on that, we can talk more, is not in fact bioelectrical, but is really this independent energy, which he now calls and comes to call orgone energy. Orgone energy, so since he has orgone energy as the central thing, the name of the therapy becomes orgone therapy or orgonomy. If you have questions, we're going to have questions and answers, so hold on. Okay? Since I'm on a time.
Well, actually, since you stopped, let me just say, we're cutting into the Q&A. We
Right.
can shave off a little bit of that and a little bit of the break.
Okay.
But if you could try to wrap this up.
Yeah, no, that's what I'm trying to do
So we
now.
can have both. the
Yeah,
break
yeah,
and the
yeah.
question.
I'll wrap it up now in the basic presentation. So then, what you have is with the introduction of and the demonstration, and this is crucial, I think, for those of you who are interested to understand, that this is not a theoretical deviation. This is a very, very real, practical demonstration of the existence of, in the laboratory and in practical terms, the existence of a literal material energy which blows Reich's mind. If you read Reich's writings on his discovery, this is not someone saying, oh, look, this is interesting, I now have these discoveries. It's like, oh my God, what have I, it's really, what have I wrought? It's like, boy, am I in trouble. I mean, he literally says things like that. If you look at his personal papers, it's like, he realizes that this is taking him in a direction that in many ways he did not necessarily want to go. The perception that Reich was always looking to be the bad boy on the outside, I think, is very, very, misunderstood and misrepresented. I think he clearly felt he was doing, to be psychoanalytically dynamic, his father's work. He was being a good boy, trying to really prove just how correct the implications of Freud's work were. But he realized with the discovery of orgone energy and the demonstration of it in the laboratory, in the material demonstration of that he had really gone someplace else, that something new had been introduced. Once you have that in place, he begins to talk about how you can work with that energy, and what we know as today classic practice of orgone energy, which we'll talk about to some degree, to one degree or other. I would probably be, in terms of the room here presently, unless some other old timers show up, I guess Bob Teeter, I'm probably one of the few orgonomists that still practices what we would call classic orgone therapy. But in terms of the development of classic orgone therapy, the key, and I'll wrap it up with this, the key final elements are that you are dealing with a literal energy that in the simplest sense, Reich's anecdotal comment to Dr. Sobey and Dr. Handelman, so it was confirmed by two, and actually Rothenberg mentioned this too in conversation, that the goal of therapy, of orgone therapy, is distinctively different than the goal of any other therapy that you're going to encounter, which is that the goal is to establish genital function and to establish as much as possible the free operation of the orgasm function, right? And therefore effective pulsation within the organism. That done, the role of the therapist, of the orgonomist, is to facilitate that, support that, and to help support the individual once that has been achieved, if that is achieved, in their engagement in the outside world, which will be often traumatic, if you haven't noticed in your own lives. Because based on a lot of Reich's later research and writing and indication, the world that we send our patients out to, right, or that we go out to as patients once we've achieved any degree of this, is essentially a world that is completely antithetical to and hostile to living that kind of life and experience, and it's a compulsive world that we live in the idea that we want to break with the compulsive lifestyle, the compulsive social environment, but in fact we all live in the compulsive world, and so did Reich, and to the extent that Reich lived in that world, it destroyed him and it will destroy most of us. So Reich had this profoundly sad insight in the fact that he was really developing a technique that was going to help people get healthier, but then have to face how hard it is to be healthy in the real world, and that we could have the fantasy of returning to nature, as the 60s demonstrated. It was exactly that, a fantasy, not a bad fantasy, and a fantasy that I think Dr. Schiff, who participated much more actively in it, that could lead to very productive and positive outcomes, but nonetheless not a miraculous or mystical solution. The final piece is to keep in mind that for Reich, the goal is always to establish the optimal ability of the organism to metabolize energy, this literal energy in an organism. Every technique, every response was based on that. The primary directive was that you get that energy moving, and you get it moving actively through the organism and pulsating in the organism any way you can. So part of the problem is that there are many people who pick up different aspects of supposedly how Reich worked with this or that, and you can ask questions about that, and we can talk about that. The reality is, from all discussions with people who knew Dr. Reich and worked with him, is he worked many different ways, right? And his primary thing was whatever it takes to get the energy moving with any individual, right, is what you use. So he was fond of, Dr. Sobey always loved to quote, he was fond of saying that Dr. Reich would say, listen, if the patient comes in and you hit them on the head with a hammer and it gets the energy moving and it gets the orgasm reflex going, that's what you do. And they'll thank you for it and they'll pay you for it, even if they have a bump on their head. It doesn't, and so that it wasn't this kind of, there is a strict way. And the one instance we have on tape, actually we have tapes of, where Reich did a seminar in which the doctors were learning how to do orgone therapy. After 4 or 5 of these sessions, the famous thing was Reich says, it's off, we're not doing it anymore. And the reason was, and I'll finish up on this, that all the doctors came in, and they were telling Dr. Reich in their private sessions with him how great this was, because now that when they work with their patients, they knew exactly how Dr. Reich would do it and how to do treatment, right? And he said, that's it, I don't want a lot of little Reichs running around. You know, I want you to learn the basic principles and learn how to be a therapist in your own, and use these principles in your own treatment. And in fact, we know when we, and that would actually be a wonderful conference. At some point, I'll finish on that remark. Okay? A wonderful conference would be to bring together as many of the actually practicing orgonomists, you know, people who are trained in this technique, to talk about how they actually work. And I think what you would discover, and I certainly discovered from speaking to many of the traditionally trained orgonomists who actually either worked with Reich or were trained pretty close to that line, that they work with a great deal of commonality in terms of the basic principles, but each one very different. The final thing was that when all of the doctors who had worked with Reich finally were free enough to talk about their treatment with Reich, not one of them had the same kind of treatment. And they were all sort of amazed, you know, and so.
Thanks a lot. Let me remind you, the whole day is about orgone therapy, so you may have lots of questions, but I would encourage that the questions now be more about the historical development that Dr. Lewis was talking about.
Right.
And keep your questions brief, and please keep your answers brief so we get as many going, and then we'll
Are
take a
you
break.
implying that I might be?
So raise your hand so I can get a lot of voices in here. Questions about the historical development? Yes, please. I'll come to you in a second. Go ahead.
You mentioned the material demonstration of orgone energy in the laboratory. Can you talk a little bit about what that involved?
Well, I mean, I think a number of other people here probably can talk about it even much more extensively than I could. I mean, essentially, once Reich set up his laboratory, eventually he began to investigate the initial investigations that led to the biophysical investigation of bioelectrical energy and sexuality were done largely in laboratory, looking at people's readings of people's excitation levels and pulse and various physical signs based on stimulation of the body. The literal isolation of orgone energy is a long and detailed process that's going to be far beyond anything I could lay out, but it's available in a number of books, mostly in the the Bion experiments, which will give you a detailed description of all of the literal work, and in the archives there's even more detailed clinical available. Essentially, the laboratory through a series of both fortuitous accidents and discoveries. Don't forget, he's looking at bioelectric function. He begins to discover that, wait a second, I'm expecting X to happen, but Y happens. So the question is, why does Y happen? And as he begins to investigate these various deviations, in the expected behavior of bioelectric energy, right, or biochemical energy, he begins to realize that he's dealing with an energy that doesn't seem to, or phenomena, he doesn't call it energy initially, a phenomena that doesn't seem to be consistent with what they're expecting to find as the physical basis of libido. He then begins to experiment with techniques to see if there's any way of materializing that energy and seeing what it is and what it looks like. This leads eventually to the isolation and description of some sort of energetic function that is not bioelectric, what has relations to bioelectrical phenomena, but is not ultimately bioelectrical. Gradually, through various research and studies, he isolates that energy. The most striking demonstration of it is somewhat later, in the vacuum tube, irradiation, in which you take a vacuum tube that essentially should not, glow or generate any visible luminescence, leave it in a intensely orgone charged room, and over a period of time, and there are photographs of it, it begins to glow blue. And so these are among the physical demonstrations, but there are numerous other microscopic examinations of the function of that energy, and demonstrations of it, and experiments that demonstrate, that you can't explain what's going on without, at least hypothesizing a specific and quantifiable energy. And he begins to work on ways to quantify it, and in doing that leads to the idea of how do you collect it, which leads to the development of accumulators.
Trevor, please.
Yeah,
Is that
Thank you.
enough?
I could be wrong, but I thought that genitality,
Mhm.
first function of the
Mhm.
orgasm is called genitality in the therapy of neurosis, came out in 27.
It did.
Yeah.
And so, because I feel like you missed like the crucial sex economy stage before the Vegeto therapy. Like, so therapy, genitality, the book came out, Freud was championing the function of the orgasm, created sex economy, and then went to Vegeto therapy.
I think you're getting too rigid in your, if you understand Reich and read Reich carefully, particularly in his personal account, it's not a kind of rigid, there's sex economy and then there's vegetotherapy.
Sex economy was never
Right.
a form of therapy.
That's right. Part of what I'm limited to how much I can address anything. Part of the understanding, you have to understand about Reich is Reich never operated in one area. So what Reich is working in the laboratory, he's also working in the clinics, in the sex pole clinics. He's also working in active youth clinics. He's also developing concepts of sex economy, as a political and social movement. He's also writing his critique of, which Dr. Menick can address in even greater detail. He's also writing his critique, his unification of Marx and Freud, which leads to really a new, theoretical structure, which basically is the basis of sex, of sex economy.
But the way you presented the history, you had him developing character analysis and then later looking at the function of the orgasm. Historically, it's the other way around. Function of the orgasm, he published in 1927,
Right.
and then published character analysis
Right.
till 33. Bob, you had a
No,
question?
but let me make something clear, okay, and we will argue about this. The fact that he's beginning to write function of the orgasm and talk about the function of the orgasm before character analysis,
Right.
historically doesn't change the fact that the central, we're talking about therapeutic approach, the central therapeutic approach that Reich is working with pretty much until 1930, we could argue 29 or 30, is essentially character analytic in nature.
Oh, yeah, he's
And the significance of and the interest in the function of the orgasm is simply, becoming background to what he's beginning to structure and think about as what the goal of character analytic work is, okay? The specific movement into vegetotherapy becomes significant is at that point he decides that you're not going to get there with within a more traditional psychoanalytic process of interpretation, and that there needs to be a much more energetic engagement and energetic interface that leads to the development of techniques that then become known as vegetotherapy. The other thing to keep in mind, which is also interesting because it was true of Freud, is that Reich, we're in this process, and you're actively in this process of dating specifically where and when things come along, and that's very good to do that, right? But Reich never worked that way, and so when you really look at the papers and you really look at the way Reich was often, writing about things well ahead of the time he ever published. He was often thinking about movements he was going to make, things he was going to explore. He was introducing ideas and experimenting with ideas that get published later. The dates on when he published things and when he introduced things and when he dates things himself are often very, very equivocal and problematic. Freud, for instance, was always well known for publishing things that he had developed 10 years before he actually finally published the paper.
The early chapters of character analysis of the paper is published in the mid-20s.
Right, that's right.
impossible.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
Bob, go ahead.
Well, just I think you, at some point, maybe you ought to explain that Rice was, at some point, started to work with the autonomic nervous system, recognized that rather than the other, they call it the vegetative nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
The other is at what point and how did he come about to develop the understanding of muscular armor? Because that's all critical.
Well, I think there again is a perfect example. In a sense, in one sense, I think anyone who really knows this material would say that he probably began to understand the nature and function of muscular armoring well into the 20s, and very early in his work. What significantly that meant in terms of how you finally deal with it or resolve it doesn't really play out exactly at the point that he begins to note it. There's clear evidence that in the early 20s, before 1927, he's already thinking about the nature and function of the armoring or what we call armor. He tends to look much more at it in terms in character analysis, certainly, which, while published later, is really something that he's writing and developing and thinking about very early. It becomes a formal book later. But the point being that he's already beginning to see that he doesn't call it muscular armor, but that there's some sort of physical manifestation and physical presentation in the patients that he's trying to deal with in terms of breaking through what he calls the character armor. At some point, and again, we'll have to see the exact, possibly through the notes and various papers, when he begins to realize that it's no longer a question of character armor, but that character armor is just one manifestation of the overall armoring and nature and function of the organism as a whole. And that certainly coincides with his beginning to understand the nature and function of muscular armoring or muscular contractions and the nature and function of the organism's attempt to ward off physical sensation, which then dovetails, and this is always where Reich is important, that dovetails into the fact that there's some sort of energetic function going on, that something is being regulated, there's something that if the body is tensing against something, if the vegetative system is resisting something, or developing a chronic resistance or a chronic block, or however you want to call it, it's because something is threatening it. And that's what leads him increasingly to begin to investigate this. When and exactly where, I would say it's probably all of the above. It's the specific dates that we can outline, but it's also at times, I suspect as we go through the archives, we're going to find that he'll make mention of these things often earlier than he ever really formally writes about them or investigates them.
Well, excuse me, we're going to take a 10 minute. Dr. Lewis will speak again after lunch. Out of deference to our next speaker, we're going to take a 10-minute break, begin again at 11:15. Thanks very much.
Make a quick business comment. Anyone who owes me money or payment, please